Hey, what's up, Bush kids? We're here for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're covering topic 7.5, World War I, Military and Diplomacy. Our learning objective today is learning objective 7F. Explain the causes and consequences of US involvement in World War I. Our first key idea says, after initial neutrality in World War I, the nation entered the conflict, departing from the US foreign policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs, in response to Woodrow Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. Now, a little bit of background on World War I itself. From 1914 to 1919, World War I raged in Europe. Now, the causes of the war in Europe began as a result of competition over imperial territories, as well as the buildup of powerful industrial militaries. In addition to this, European rivalries led to two military alliances that threatened to draw European nations into war. Those two European alliances were of Austria-Hungary, Italy, and Germany, forming what was called the Triple Alliance, with England, France, and Russia forming the Triple Entente. The pre-alliance network looked very much like this, with the Triple Alliance on one side, and as well as the Ottoman Empire, and the Triple Entente on another. Now, these rivalries due to militarism and imperialism increased nationalism among European powers. Nationalism is this idea of this strong love of one's country. Now, it's slightly different than patriotism, in that in nationalism you believe not only in your country, but you don't like or love other nations, and you have a strong desire to prove the strength of your own nation. Now, in the Balkans, nationalism was particularly strong. Now, nowhere was that dispute more likely to occur than in the Balkan Peninsula. Now, this mountainous peninsula in the southeastern corner of Europe was home to an assortment of ethnic groups, with a long history of nationalist uprisings and ethnic clashes. The Balkans was known as the powder keg of Europe. By the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire, which included the Balkan region, was in rapid decline. While some Balkan groups struggled to free themselves from the Ottoman Turks, others already had succeeded in breaking away from their Turkish rulers. These people had formed new nations, including Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, Romania, and Serbia. Nationalism was a powerful force in these countries. Each group longed to extend its borders. Serbia, for example, had a large Slavic population. It hoped to absorb all the Slavs on the Balkan Peninsula. Russia, itself a mostly Slavic nation, supported Serbian nationalism. However, Serbia's powerful northern neighbor, Austria-Hungary, opposed such an effort. Austria feared that efforts to create a Slavic state would stir rebellion among its Slavic population. In 1908, Austria annexed or took over Bosnia and Herzegovina. These were two Balkan areas with large Slavic populations. Serbian leaders who had sought to rule these provinces were outraged. In the years that followed, tensions between Serbia and Austria steadily rose. The Serbs continually vowed to take Bosnia and Herzegovina away from Austria. In response, Austria-Hungary vowed to crush any Serbian effort to undermine its authority in the Balkans. Now, these underlying historical contexts really go to show how this was going to prove to be the powder keg that was going to erupt Europe. Everything came to a head then in 1914. In 1914, Serbian terrorists assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered the start of World War I. Germany and Austria-Hungary were joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire to form the Central Powers. England, France, and Russia became the Allied powers and were eventually joined by many nations throughout the world, including the United States. The eventual lineup of World War I on either side looked very much like this. Now, the outbreak of World War I in 1914 was a test for America's new foreign policy. By 1914, The United States was a world power with overseas territory and influence in Latin America and Asia, thanks to America's imperialism as well as our open door policy in Asia. However, despite America's increased power in the world, we wanted to remain neutral to avoid involvement in Europeans' Great War. However, despite efforts by President Woodrow Wilson to remain neutral, the United States would eventually join World War I in 1917. We joined the war for several reasons. First, Americans were outraged by German violations of U.S. neutrality and free trade. In addition, they did this mostly through what was called their unrestricted submarine warfare, and they attacked passenger ships such as the Lusitania, where many Americans lost their lives. In addition, Americans were also outraged by what was called the Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany offered to return the Mexican cession if Mexico went to war with the United States. Mexico was worried that the United States would enter the war, since for a time between 1915 and the end of 1916, Germany had promised to stop their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. However, they had planned on restarting that program and feared that the United States would soon enter the war. Although we remained neutral from 1914 to 1917, in April of 1917, Congress will declare war on the Central Powers. President Woodrow Wilson had promised to make, quote, the world safe for democracy, leading us then to key idea number 2. Although the American Expeditionary Force played a relatively limited role in combat, the United States entry helped to tip the balance in the favor of the Allies. Now, we had gotten involved in the war very late. The war had been raging from 1914 all the way through 1917 when we finally joined in April. It had been going on for nearly 3 years. And so when we arrive at an incredibly important time. Fresh American soldiers and war supplies will help the Allies at this crucial time when everybody was tired of fighting. Now, U.S. soldiers are part of the American Army called the American Expeditionary Force, and sometimes individual soldiers are referred to as doughboys. They saw their first action in May of 1918 outside of Paris, and they helped to resist a German offensive and participated in a counterattack against Germany. Now, throughout 1918, the American Expeditionary Force fought with Allied forces to help turn the tide of the war. And by October of 1918, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire had surrendered. And on November 9th, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated, meaning he left his throne. The fighting would finally end on November 11th, 1918, when Germany will sign an armistice with the Allies and World War I will come to an end. The U.S. reluctantly entered World War I and played only a supportive role in the fighting, but the war changed America. One of the ways that the war changed America was that even though we had only fought for 8 months, not the 4 years like many other European nations had fought for, and we only had 7% casualties, not the 52% like most Allied powers, we still had a large number of Americans killed during this war. In total, our total battlefield deaths was 116,000 in just 8 months. In total, 22 million soldiers and civilians will die in World War I, 20 million wounded, and 10 million will become refugees during the war. You can see some of the brutal pictures of both civilian and military dead over the next few slides. In addition to this, gruesome injuries would scar an entire generation for life. And entire towns, like here, are completely, and almost completely, wiped off the map. The war was expensive, costing an estimated $338 billion, and massive funds would be needed to rebuild Europe. Now, the aftermath of the war will be as important as the war itself, leading us to key idea number 3. Despite Wilson's deep involvement in post-war negotiations, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League of Nations. When World War I ended, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson believed that America should take a lead in shaping the peace process. Near the end of the war, Wilson developed a peace plan called the 14 Points. Now, this 14 Points peace plan was based on eliminating the reasons for World War I, for instance, militarism and imperialism. And he hoped to avoid all future wars by creating an international organization to discuss and to arbitrate problems. Now, generally speaking, the 14 points contain 3 main themes or ideas. The first 5 focused on creating new international rules that would eliminate future wars. For instance, freedom of the seas in peace and war, equality of trade conditions, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims with reference to the wishes of the governed people. Points 6 through 13 focused on dividing weak empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire into new nations based on self-determination. Wilson believed that new nations should have borders drawn with consideration to ethnic and national identities, and he wanted new nations to be free to choose their own governments. However, the most important of these 14 points was point 14, and this focused on creating a League of Nations to settle all future international problems by diplomacy rather than by war. Now, to achieve this, President Wilson will travel to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to help create the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson hoped his 14 points would become the framework for the peace treaty. But Wilson quickly learned that European leaders wanted to punish Germany and did not share his vision for peace without victory. Now, during the peace process, Wilson had to compromise on many of his 14 points. However, on June 28, 1919, the delegates agreed, and what became known as the Treaty of Versailles was finally signed. Now, the delegates at the Paris Peace Conference agreed to create this League of Nations. It was an agreement that member nations would work together to stop future acts of aggression, and it was made up of 27 nations in a General Assembly. Members agreed to use diplomacy, not war, to settle conflicts, and they also agreed to work together to stop future acts of aggression. In addition, the Treaty of Versailles redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. Central Europe was redrawn to reduce the power of Austria-Hungary, and German territories were used to create Poland. Germany's border with France was demilitarized as well to prevent future invasions. You can see on the map on the bottom the before and after pictures of Europe and the Middle East as a result of the wars. The red countries on the right were new nations created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Additionally, the Ottoman Empire was divided. Britain and France gained mandates, that means territory in the Middle East. And these new nations were created from territory taken from Russia, who left World War I early after the Russian Revolution. In addition to this, the Treaty of Versailles severely punished Germany for its role in World War I. Germany was forced to surrender all of its overseas colonies, its military was reduced, and it was forbidden from building weapons. And Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay $33 billion in war reparations. Calculated for inflation, that $33 billion would equal about $570 billion today. However, the Treaty of Versailles did not address the important issues that caused World War I. For instance, it did not require any allied nations to demilitarize or give up their imperial colonies. It did not address the secret alliances, nor did it guarantee free trade on the seas. And the treaty was so severe that it kept Germany from rebuilding, creating a lot of hostility at this particular time. Now, even though the major Allied and Central Powers signed the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. President Wilson could not sign the treaty because the Constitution gave the Senate the power to approve treaties. What this would require was a 2/3 vote in the Senate and to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. However, many senators did not like the treaty because signing it meant joining the League of Nations. Many senators, known as strong reservationists, demanded changes to the League covenants that required members to work together to stop aggression. For instance, Article 10 of the League Covenant said that the member of the League undertake and respect and preserve as against aggression the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. Now, this meant that the United States would have to jump in, and it would entangle us in foreign affairs, something that Washington specifically warned us against in his farewell address. Senators known as the Irreconcilables wanted the U.S. to return to isolationism and refused to sign the treaty or commit to the League of Nations. Now, the Irreconcilables and strong reservationists attacked the treaty and the League of Nations, and Wilson supported our membership in the League and refused to compromise with the Senate. Wilson would tour the country of the United States to try and gain public support for the treaty. However, during it, he had a stroke during the tour, much hampering his efforts to drum up public support. In 1920, Republican Warren Harding ran for the president and promised a return to normalcy and rejection of the League of Nations. By the way, you seen that anywhere recently? Well, with Harding's victory in 1920, the Senate voted against the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations. And even though many of the major powers in the world would join the League of Nations, the United States never did, and we signed our own peace treaty with Germany in 1921. Now, as a result of World War I, the United States is going to begin the 20th century as an imperial power. And although we reluctantly entered World War I to protect free trade, our involvement in the war led to many domestic changes that we'll talk about in a subsequent lecture. And the United States will play an important and major role in the peace process. But our refusal to join the League weakened the ability to stop world leaders and eventually to stop the outcome of World War II. Well, that's all of our lecture for today. What we've covered so far today is we've covered the causes of World War I, including militarism, imperialism, the alliance system, and nationalism. We've covered the reasons why the United States entered the war, for instance, our freedom of the seas, sinking of ships due to unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmerman telegram. We've covered our limited, though important, involvement in the war through the Allied Expeditionary Force and how we're able to turn the tide of victory. And we've also talked about Wilson's failed attempts to bring peace to the world through the Treaty of Versailles and how many people in the United States feared that the treaty and joining the League would entangle us in the rest of the world. Well, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And until next time, and as always, go Pack.